But what we're doing, we're looking at things in phases, and those phases prominently relate to trauma, returning veterans from various wars, combat situations. We're going to look at the inconsistency between community and health agencies, mental health as well. And we're going to look at the trauma related to people in prison and the situations that they face coming home. Time permitting, we'll also be looking at immigration. We'll be looking at immigration into this country, as well as internal migration, groups moving from one section of the country to the other. Most particularly, poor white farmers and the so-called Dust Bowl in the 1930s that John Steinbeck made very impactful in a couple of movies, Tobacco Road and Grapes of Wrath. And then we're going to look at the so-called Great Migration of African Americans from the South to the urban North. Some 4.5 million people between 1914 and 1920. So those, particularly the latter one, the Great Migration, will have the biggest impact on urban communities in this country. That's where we are. We're going to try to get through most of this, and we'll be having people coming in who have expertise in these areas to share with us as well. What's your major, or have you declared yet?
I'm actually a freshman medical student, taking a semester off to do research.
All right, all right.
I'm public health behavior society.
Yeah, we have several public health majors. Good, I'm glad to have you with me. Very good. All right, do you have any questions from last, what was it, Monday's presentation? All right. You know what I'd like to do? I'd like to, no questions, I'd like to have you, I'm going to try to proselyte all of you to be members of my church. I love it when people have questions. I'm just kidding, of course. But we're looking at the hesitancy on the part of veterans, particularly combat veterans, to be open to others, and usually they're only open to persons who have had like experiences to theirs. One of the reasons why there is a negative feeling with respect to veterans and the institutions that exist, the health and mental health institutions that exist primarily for their care, is the fact that they are manned or personed by civilians. And they just do not feel that civilians, however well trained in the areas of psychology, can satisfy most of the traumatic situations that they face, particularly those who are poor and those who have various kinds of mental health issues that need to be addressed. So they just stay away, and they very, very seldom, unless it's upon the urgence and encouragement of the family, very seldom do they seek public or private non-veteran oriented agencies such as hospitals, for an example, for help, because they just feel that it's not going to be forthcoming. So they live with these things. They live with their trauma, they live with their mental health issues, they live with their poverty, and as a result, they make themselves fundamentally of non-effect in terms of providing social contributions. So we're trying to raise the awareness here so that whatever career or profession you choose, should you be in a position to encounter persons who are veterans, you would have some understanding of their needs and what they go through as women and men back. And I'm emphasizing women because for the first time in American social history, women have a decided percentage, or are relatively high in the percentages of persons coming back from various wars. And this country goes from one war to another. That's where it's been happening since 1980, about 35 years now or more. So we can see the numbers of women increasing over the years ahead. That's something we need to certainly be prepared for. I'm of the belief, though, that women can best serve women. In my counseling as a clergy person, I feel sometimes off base when it comes to problems brought to me by women. So I'm quick to make a referral whenever I can to someone who could best address these. I can certainly address some of them, but there are some that I can't. And I will not even attempt to, because one of the worst things that a counselor can do is to give the wrong information. And that can lead to some very serious situations. But whenever I can. That's why I try to keep on my staff at least one female clergy person that I can make a quick referral to over situations that I feel that I'm inadequate as a man to address. That's something we need to certainly be aware of as well. Women to women, that's the best, in my opinion, and I might be wrong, but in my opinion, in my experiences, that's the best kind of rapport that you can establish. So we need to have women in public health agencies who have an opportunity to have face-to-face encounters with females who are coming back home from military service. To me, it's very, very important. But let's go ahead with this. I'm hoping that on Monday we'll have a representative from a veterans organization to speak with you. I think you would get a great deal of encouragement from that. Now, let's understand that the consequences of poverty, crime, and the post-traumatic depression of combat experiences are staggering. They're staggering. There is an extant document that I do not have. I've read it, but I misplaced it. I was going to have it duplicated for your reading. I still might have it, even though we get beyond this. If I find it, I'm going to duplicate it. It's about 3 pages long, but single space, written by Thomas Porpiglia, who is a PTSD, I'm not going to call him expert, but he's a person who has been involved in this as a veteran, but has really developed his own personal skills in dealing with it forthrightly. But his writings relative to veterans, to me, is very informative. It's politically correct, simply because most wars are capitalist-based and are fought by the poor and the lowly educated since Vietnam. That's Mr. Perpiglia's take on it as a veteran, and I'm in agreement with him on that wise. But as a result, opportunities of domestic or post-war health issues, that's one. Re-educational concerns or family readjustment. Those 3 areas are tight, very tough. But within that trinity, veterans are burdened with enormous psychological problems, and much of it revolving around spiritual anxiety and the guilt related, again, to combat survival. Why me and not him or them? Now, the plight of poor white veterans returning to their communities is bad, but for the black veteran, it's worse. As a, pardon me, as a black veteran, we are told basically nothing at the time of our discharge. They just give us a little bit of money and thank us for what we've done, and to tell us, they're quick to remind us that we can be called back within 90 days. And many of them go back. But we can keep our rank and we can keep everything for 90 days. After 90 days, it's all over. We're to consider ourselves, unless we go into the reserves, we can consider ourselves as civilians. But let's look at some social history behind all of this. Any questions? All right. Some social history. Now, a lot has been written concerning various forms of drug addiction experienced by combat personnel during the Vietnam War, and of some men actually being narcoticized while fighting, such as the Chinese during the Korean War. If any of you order, my wife ordered a coat, a winter jacket, and it came, but it was done and made in China, and it came all the way. It had all that, Chinese language on it. Fortunately, underneath it was interpreting what was above in China, but she got it. It was made in some province in China, but it's well matted. I mean, you can put it on in sub-zero weather and you'd still sweat. I mean, that's how fortified it is. Now, during the Korean War, when the North Korean army was pretty much wiped out, the South Korean army rather, pretty much wiped out, the Chinese came into the war to support them. The Communist China, as it was called, crossed the Yalu River and came in. Now, during the early part of the fighting, because the weather gets, the coldest I recall Korea getting was 38 below zero. That's cold. Minneapolis, it's like summertime. 38 degrees below zero. But my body is so, I think, well composed, it has always been, that anything below zero, like 120, doesn't matter. Still freezing cold to me. But it said 38 below zero. Well, these men came over to fight, to aid the South Korean army, which is really to aid the North Korean army, because MacArthur had pushed them right at the river, Yalu River. The next step would be Manchuria, Chinese-held territory. So the Chinese got into war on the side of the North Koreans and actually pushed the American forces all the way out of the area. But some of the Chinese men were captured, and inside of that matted jacket there were morphine capsules, and they would take these morphine capsules and they would fight. Sometimes they didn't have any weapons at all. They just had whatever they had, but no rifles. But this dulled the senses apparently, and created almost you might call it a fanatical kind of charge, but finding this morphine and other drug type substances, some of the men obviously kept them and used them themselves, although this type of thing wasn't as well publicized as it was during the Vietnam War, because it was in the Vietnam War that the drug kind of information kind of developed, and people were saying that the majority of men who were being released from Vietnam have been addicted. Well, that wasn't true, but it was true to some degree. But let's look at, again, the social history. The easy accessibility of opium, marijuana, and other drugs, opium, marijuana, and other drugs, made it relatively smooth for some of those drugs to be brought into the United States by its soldiers. Now, the truth is that indeed many soldiers return home from Vietnam under addiction. That cannot be countered. But this did not begin with the tragedy in Vietnam. It started in 1865. Excuse me. Though German scientists had discovered morphine as early as 1806, a long time ago, it was nearly 60 years later, the mid-1860s, before it was put to common use in the United States. It was first introduced to be a medical supplement. By 1865, as a result of the American Civil War, battlefield amputations, and other field hospital surgeries were terrifyingly high. If a man was wounded in the leg, they just cut it off. That's all they knew what to do. That's all they could do. These field hospitals were brutal. But before the conclusion of the war, morphine was introduced to military surgeons who utilized its sedation capabilities during battlefield surgeries. You remember the old Western movies where if somebody was shot and they had to do anything to them medically, they'd put a coin in their mouth or something, now bite down hard. And when they would bite down hard, they would go ahead and saw off or do whatever they were going to do. But nonetheless, that was kind of true. But morphine was introduced to military doctors who took well advantage of it. Now, many of the men treated who survived returned to their homes addicted. So much so, and so many, and so visible, because most of them were homeless. By 1875, morphine addiction was being described as, quote, the soldier's disease. Opium houses started some short spell after this, and mostly in the two large areas, San Francisco, New York City, where you could go in, because it was legal, you could go in as long as you did everything on the spot. You could go in and smoke as much drugs as you would wish to. You'd get high, and then you'd leave. But those were called opium dens, or whatever you want to call them, opium houses. They were basically conducted by the Chinese. When cocaine first came on the scene, it was understood to be pharmaceutical. It was not illegal. We drink today Pepsi Cola. We drink today Coca-Cola. Anything with cola and cocaine, that's the relationship with it. Was in every cough syrup imaginable was laced with cocaine because it was legal. And it didn't become illegal until the 1930s. But prior to the 1930s, the utilization of cocaine, as long as it was supposedly medically applied, was considered, or even recreationally through Coca-Cola. That's where that comes from. They used to have, you ask your grandparents about this, but in your parents would be too young. And they stopped this in the 1950s, but you could go into a soda fountain and you could get a milkshake, you could get a sundae, you could get all of the malts. You could also get what was known as a Coke. And this was an ice cream substance. That's all it was, ice cream. But it had cocaine in it. That's why they called it Coke. And they found out that it was addictive, so they eliminated it. So now you can no longer get a Coke when you go to a soda fountain. You can't even find a soda fountain anymore. I think they're all gone. But nonetheless, it was a good place to stop and get a milkshake, you and your sweetheart. One milkshake, 2 straws, please. Those are the good old, y'all don't know what I'm talking about. Y'all have money. When you're poor, you get 2 straws. You suck on one, your sweetheart sucks on the other. And that was fun. But Coke was a very visible and a very obtainable particle simply because it was legal. Once the pharmaceutical agencies began to really crack down and the FDA was formed, it became an illegal substance. So that during the night from the 1930s on, all forms of what was known as any kind of drug was outlawed. You might see this film. Every now and then they bring it back because it was a tough film to watch. It was called Reefer Madness. Anyone ever see that? It was from 1938. Yeah. Okay. And it really did kind of go overboard, but nonetheless it talked about what can happen to young people if they smoke what they used to call reefer, which is marijuana. But it was probably in its heyday. We think that it's prevalent during our time. Well, yes it is, but it was more so during the 1930s, from the mid-20s down to the mid-30s, when Prohibition was in effect. So a lot of people felt if you can't drink yourself high, there must be other forms that you can use to do this. So that's how the other drugs came into practice, particularly marijuana, which is known as reefer then. I'm not really sure when they started calling it marijuana. They used to call it just reefer. But then, of course, the other type of drugs. And then you can always, depending upon how creative you are, you can always make your own stuff. When I was in the Army, we used to sneak, and we used to take Aqua Velva. That's an aftershave lotion, ladies. It's called Aqua Velva. After you take a shower, it makes you smell good. It's Aqua Velva. We used to get a big thing of Aqua Velva, Coca-Cola, white bread, and shoe polish. Mix it all together and drain it through the white bread. White bread has to turn a certain color. If it turns the color you're looking for, you got it. Into a bottle, we shake it up, we bury it in the ground, and then we dig it up, and we pass it around, and we drink it, and we get as high as a kite. Now don't y'all do that, please. I'm glad they don't sell, they still sell Aqua Velva, but it isn't popular like it used to be. But many ways you could, guys know how to do it. If you're in the Army and you have a lot of guys from the South, they'll tell you how to do it. One guy we had from Oklahoma, he went out behind where we were living. We stayed in Quonset huts, and he dug in the ground and he made his own. He had the little plastic things, and he created his own little steel. And he actually had a steel back there. And he took us back there, and we saw it, and we tasted it. Good. It was good. And so we found out another way that we could get without worrying about being caught and without having to spend all that money buying a bottle of liquor. Now that was in my old days. That was before I was converted, but it was good. It was nice, and we enjoyed it because there was nothing else to do. No women, nothing. So what we did, we just celebrated among ourselves the best way we could. If we had a bottle, we'd pass it around. Everybody could get as high as they wanted to through the same device. But again, that was then, this is now. Now we're looking at all of this stuff simply because it was so easy to get addicted. Here we're talking about the infusion of drugs in our society. Many of the men who come home are addicted simply because of the soldier's disease. Many of these men from this period of time, certainly all the way up to World War II, many of them were denied any basic treatment for their addiction. They became a flotsam, homeless, debilitated nomads. That's who they were. Subsequently, many died in their addiction, or many died from hunger. Many of them plunged into mental illness, if not the majority. And the drug demons persisted as this scenario would repeat itself in the next century, the 20th century. Now, all of that was from the Civil War. But men returning from the two world wars, World War I and World War II, fared no better, because morphine was joined by cocaine and alcohol in the attempt to help them forget or repress the mayhem they had experienced from poison gas attacks by the Germans to bitter memories of combat. Now, the Germans violated conventional warfare by utilizing poison gas, and after World War I, as part of the Versailles Peace Conference in 1919, all of the European nations agreed that no longer would they use poison gas. But again, the Italians would violate it in the mid-1930s when they used poison gas to defeat the Ethiopians in 1936. But that was a horrible, horrible, horrible death. Poison gas. But a lot of the guys, they were exposed to it, and they came back home. And many of these men who were poisoned in 1917, that's 100 years ago, and 1918, those are the only, the United States was, the World War I actually started in 1914, but the involvement of the United States was only for 2 years, 17 and 18, because initially President Woodrow Wilson was very conservative politically and felt that isolationism would be the best course for the United States to take, but they found out that he couldn't, simply because Britain was heavily involved. This country has always had a very friendly and compatible relationship with Great Britain ever since the Revolution. So it got into the war late, very late, 1917, 1918, but still lost thousands and thousands of men in the war. Many were killed as a result or died as a result of being gassed. But nonetheless, many of these hospitals were isolated. The mental health wards were under-facilitated. They were very poorly operated. And in what they called veterans hospitals, some of the veterans lingered for decades before dying. The men who returned from World War I would compose a significant impoverished class. It really created a new class of poverty in this country. And one of the things that this did, hauntingly, that would lead to many of the difficulties of the late 1920s, it would create vast pockets of unemployment. In addition, it created a lot of family decomposition and inevitably criminal activity. Talk about the Roaring Twenties, the height of the era of gangsterism. It'd be nice to take a check and see how many of those guys were veterans. Now, denied, I'm sure you know about this, but if you don't, you need to do some reading. But denied their rightful veterans bonus. You see, veterans are promised at the end of every war to get a bonus for their combat participation, for their military, to get a bonus. They say, well, you can expect to get it. They're pretty honest about the timeline. Within 5 years after your discharge, you'll get a bonus. Show your government's appreciation for what you've done. Some guys never got it. Although it was promised congressionally, they never got it. Now, I got mine only because when I got mine, former General Dwight Eisenhower was President of the United States. And part of his campaign pledge during the Korean War was, you vote for me, you'll get your bonus. And most of us thought that included everybody, but it didn't, just the Korean guys. But nonetheless, you know, I was fine. But it wasn't fine for them. The World War II guys were very late getting theirs, and they had this whole thing about they're waiting for us to die off, and I really believe that. But listen to what happened, though, with the guys from World War I. This is what I'm sure during your American history classes, you must talk about this. But denied their rightful veterans bonus from the war, that's World War I, and denied access to federal authorities, they tried their very, very best to create some kind of a meeting, some kind of a dialogue with federal authorities about their bonus. They couldn't. As a result of that, World War I veterans sought to dramatize their grievances. And in 1932, just think how many thousands of World War I guys had died. We're talking 13 years. But in 1932, they organized what was perhaps the first March on Washington, demanding their pensions. They tried to set up a tent city. Martin Luther King Jr. was not the first person to think about creating a tent city in Washington. World War I veterans first had this idea, and they did that to demand their pensions. But they were met by federal troops at the command of President Hoover, and the troops were under the command of who? What great general from World War II? He was a colonel in these days. Douglas MacArthur. He led a shooting slaughter of many of these luckless Americans right there in Washington, D.C., in the shadow of the White House. No one, not even the church, not even the church, no one throughout this whole nation picked up their cause. They were poor, they were weakly educated, they were aging, and they were simply ignored, becoming a part of the miserable crowd of the Great Depression, selling pencils on the corner for a penny, while pleading to strangers, and this is the title of a song that came out of those days, "Brother, can you spare a dime?" So what in 2016 that is described, well, that's when I put this together, but what in 2016, 17, that is described as post-traumatic depression would victimize scores of veterans following World War II and Korea. Though institutional improvements in diagnostic care had taken place, many men with deep psychological problems were seldom if ever treated, listen to this, treated due to the prioritizing of medical treatment to men who had been returned with a multitude of physical battlefield wounds. So the priority was treating wounded veterans, not treating those who were mentally distressed as a result of war. Now, many who survive wars physically intact without being shot, but they would suffer enormous struggles mentally. We talk about survivor's guilt. We all know what that is. But listen, if you will, and just place yourself in this position. To witness daily death, destruction, and combat depression, and to further witness the violent death of children was more than many men could endure. You have dead children everywhere. That's what he wrote. Dead kids. Kids, 3, 4 years old. Nothing to do with the war. But nothing produces this kind of trauma like the pain of combat survival. Now, you believe me, but you would have to be a veteran of a war to truly understand the remarkable bonding that exists between men. Remarkable bonding. Who together, collectively, face this kind of deprivation. The uncertainty of it and the nagging reality of death daily. That's why when you're young, you're in that situation, you're 18, 19, 20, you should be in high school or you should be in college. Here you are with a uniform on, muddy, dirty, smelly, rifle in your hand. But you know, you could die anytime. That's the reality. So that's why many men try to deal with it, drink as much as they can, have as much fun as they can when they can, because tomorrow certainly is not a promise, not at all. And there is no fraternal affection as powerful as this. Not in college fraternities. I'm an alpha. Not in college fraternities, not among law enforcers, not on athletic teams, and not even in churches and other religious institutions, nor in normal productive friendships. Nothing can compare to the love, the solidarity, and the camaraderie experienced by men who are asked to sacrifice their lives for their country. Many do. Many don't come home. They're mostly poor. They have low social expectations. They are considered expendable with not much future beyond the military. They are men who are endearingly known as a dog face or a grunt, who provide the most splendid example of a soldier. Brave, courageous, serving. Questions?
Yeah, when you mentioned that, I think about the split that happened with the country in terms of the reception that World War I and World War II veterans received from the public versus what Vietnam veterans received from the public. And then even within the fact that they both sacrificed their lives in this war, the Great War veterans didn't really want to receive the Vietnam veterans. So it's all of what you're saying plus.
There was
that-
no peace protests
No,
during either World War. You had conscientious objectors that started, COs started in World War I. But conscientious objectors went into the military, they did non-combative, they drove ambulances, they were trained as medics, but they couldn't carry a gun. There was nothing going on back home to protest the two world wars or Korea. It was considered a dutiful experience because America at that time was a country full of idealism, full of it. Not much was happening on college campuses besides just support for your institution and support for the political process and support for any kind of engagement such as a war. Now, I've talked to a lot of guys from Vietnam because I just know them so well. I talked to one man who's a pastor of a church, and he told me that he did 2 tours in Vietnam. And that by the time he got home, the anti-war protest was so high, and guys who fought in Vietnam were so vilified that he was ashamed and he was afraid to wear his uniform. That's how bad it was. Guys who, during my time in the 50s, we never had that problem. When I got out, I was still in the Army, and I was on a train, had my uniform on. There was another black guy with me. And we're on a train going from Texas someplace. And the train went through a town called Ogden, Utah. I think it's close to Salt Lake City because we remember going through Salt Lake City, but we didn't stop. But I forgot which side of Salt Lake City was on, Ogden, which side of Salt Lake City. But nonetheless, we went to a place called Ogden. And the train had about a 2 or 3 hour layover. And some of the white guys on the train with us who were in the military said, "Oh, come on, you guys, let's go, let's get a drink." And I said, "Well, we don't know, it's Utah. We need black people with Brigham Young. We don't know about all this." They said, "Oh, come on, we have." So we went, and we came to this. It really was a saloon because you could hear the honky-tonk music, and all the guys had on boots, and the sidewalks were wooden, and then boom, boom, and the big hats. I said, "Oh, let's go." I said, "No, we're going." We went in there, and wasn't any women there. It must have been kind of like a sports bar. So anyway, all the guys smoking and drinking. And we went in there, 2 black guys out of all of these white guys. And we could not buy a drink. They just wrapped their arms around. They were all World War II vets mostly, and they were saying, "Yeah, man, bless." They were talking back with their experiences, and we almost missed our train because they treated us so good. That is not what the guys coming to Vietnam received. They got the cold shoulder, and a lot of it was due to college protests. That started the whole thing, but the college protests started going another way because it was taken over by others who tended to really point a negative finger at all military activity. But it started, I can tell you the exact year that it started, 1967, when they had at the University of Wisconsin a teach-out. That's what they called it. That's the first time I think the term was used, a teach-out on Vietnam. And that's when the Vietnam War looked as if it was really going to escalate into a very, very long experience, in which it did. The war itself didn't end until 1974. And still we had the Tet Offensive by the North Vietnamese yet to occur. But this teach-out at the University of Wisconsin really split the student population, really it began to really split the nation over the Vietnam War. So you're absolutely right. The temperament or the mood, even though the mood for earlier returning guys was one of at least appreciation, mildly, they still did not get the care that they needed because the institutions just were not utilizing whatever capabilities they had to deal with PTSD. Actually, it's a new term when applied to veterans, something that has occurred simply because now that the wars that this country get involved in have taken on the aura of Americanism. Attitudes have changed. Attitudes started changing after the Persian Gulf War. As a matter of fact, out of the White House, it said, we've been shamed because of Vietnam, which they were. You get involved in a war, and you stay in a war 7 years, and you don't win it, you know, it's either a nothing tie, or you lost the war. As a matter of fact, when that war ended, and when the Korean War ended, it ended with both sides at the same parallel line that existed prior to the war. So you had thousands and thousands of people killed, putting those two wars together, well over 1 million people dead for nothing. It was a political struggle. It was a war of capitalist orientation. And as a result of it, poor people really suffered. But if this country had treated returning veterans with the kind of medication that would be needed, the kind of attention that would be needed, a lot of the things that existed, especially with respect to poverty, in my opinion, would not have occurred. But we neglected it, and as a result of neglecting it, we find ourselves, even yet today, seriously behind in treating women and men who are coming back home. If we look at the divorce rate of returning veterans who are married, it's extremely high. That and the spousal statistics regarding law enforcement personnel, very high. Alcoholism, both of law enforcement personnel and returning veterans, very high. I'm not too sure of the psychological disorders that police have had or are having, but I do want the wreckage it's taken with respect to the minds of veterans. What I refer to as as productive friendships, when they fall out, and they do, it can be very tormenting, very much so. But at any rate, to me, these are really a unique band of brothers, mostly poor, as I said, and with not much else going for them. Any questions? Yes.
When you were a soldier in the Korean War, were you aware of the capitalist motivations behind it?
No.
No.
Just about everybody who fights in a war, what they call propaganda. Because see, we sit during basic training. We sit in a dark room, and they show films all the time. And it's really propaganda. But they're films about the enemy, films about Americanism, films about what the military is trying to do, and always we are non-aggressors. So we have we're gung-ho, just gung-ho. That's what we were. We were ready to get out there. Let's go, let's fight, let's save this country. Because we all had the idea in mind that as long as we fight an enemy and a projected enemy, we were really sparing the people back home. And even though I was black and I knew that there were major inequities in this country, that really didn't matter as long as we felt that our families were safe, our families were protected. We're going to get out there with the rest, and we're going to really struggle, because one of the things that they sought to do was to project racial tolerance. So some of these films tried to bring black and white military people together for the purposes of comradeship, for the purposes of being a better illustration of what we're doing, that it's hard to fight a war, and the Chinese especially made plain to the United States troops, it's hard for you black guys to fight a war when you go back home and you can't vote. You had to take a back seat in a restaurant. If the restaurant will let you in, you can't stay at a hospital. Why are you fighting? Chinese would drop leaflets to where most of the black soldiers were, and had all these things. Why are you fighting us? You know, you come over and be with us. We'll go home with us, and you can do anything you want. This, that, and the other. But you just try to throw it out of your mind because you recognize you have a uniform on, you've taken an oath, you got to take that oath before you go to training. You're in the Army 3 days, you had to take that oath. And that binds you. And if you break that oath, you can be shot. They tell you, these are what you'll be shot for. So, you know, you just bear it. I got 2 years, I got 3 years, I'll get through it. Nobody thinks they're going to get killed. Nobody. The same guy that's making plans for when he gets out gets killed that same day. But nobody, especially if you're young, you're going to live forever. You're forever. I'll get through this. You're going to live forever. When I was your age, I didn't think about dying. See, that's what old folks thought about. Not me. Shoot, I'm 20. I'm 19. I'm 21. I got a long time to live. You know, those guys over there, they can shoot at me all they want to. They're not going to hit me. That's what you think. That's what you're programmed to think. That's how you psychologically are able to deal with this thing. But we had a sergeant when I was going through basic training in Texas, and he said, when you're going to combat, he said, you look for old guys like me. You do what I do, and you'll live to come back home. And that was basically true. You know, it was basically true. You keep your eye on the guys that have gone through it, do what they do what they tell you to do. Always wear your steel helmet, always keep your head down as low as possible when being fired upon. But you never think you're going to get killed. No. Every letter you send back home is so optimistic. You know, you never talk about the war, you talk about what you're going to do when you get home. How's my dog? Yeah. Write to your sweetheart. Hey, honey, I'll be home in 6 months. You know, things of this nature. You don't write about, I'm scared, I'm this happened. I lost 7 buddies the other day, this and no. You don't say that. Because every letter, everything that comes from the front, they used to call it the front, where the shooting is going on, has to be tinged with optimism. If not, because every letter had to be inspected. And if not, they'd scratch it out. They blot it out, and the letter goes home. So if you can ask your grandparents, because they were children during World War II, or young people, if their brothers or parents were fighting in the war, did they ever get, they called it V-mail. V-mail, V for victory. That was a V for victory. Called it V-mail. And if some of the lines in a letter were blotched out, it was because you couldn't say that, because you would, because the fifth column were a group of spies, used mostly from Europe, some from Asia, who were in the country. And the fifth column, although a lot of it was really imagery, but the movies really, woo. But nonetheless, they wanted everything to be as secret as possible. Couldn't tell them where you were. You could tell them, I'm in Europe, but you can't say where. They'll blot it out if you do. But, you know, everything had to be optimistic, so that mothers and everybody else receiving letters were gloating over the fact that their son was safe, and that they got a letter from him last week, and things were seem to be going very well. Until there's a knock on the door, and there'll be 2 men in the military. And one will tell the lady, we regret to, and the mother generally, we regret to inform you that your son, Corporal so-and-so, was killed in battle in France. And then they give her mother flag, medal, and they turn and they go. Sometimes when a man is killed in combat, if it's known that they have a best friend, they'll relieve that best friend from combat to accompany the body back home. And I've talked to 1 or 2 of those guys, and they will tell you that they'd rather be on the front lines fighting rather than have that terrible, terrible experience of meeting the families of men who are gone. Just as it's hard. But they do it, and you see 2 guys coming up on somebody's porch with something small in their hand. You know what that is. They're telling the mother generally, or the wife, that their loved one has been killed, or missing. If they're missing, they'll send you a telegram. But killed, they usually will make a physical appearance at your door. All right, any questions? Yes.
Do you think that sort of like optimism and repression that they had to sort of put up that front in the letters, do you think that contributed to both the trauma that they experienced coming home and also the sort of need to like keep it to themselves?
Kind of. Keeping things to oneself is usually an individual decision. It doesn't, most guys, unless they're placed in a position, they won't talk about it, not at all. There was a movie that came out several years ago called Daddy, What Did You Do During the War? That's the name of the movie, Daddy, What Did You Do During the War? But most men won't talk about it. And if they isolate themselves personally with respect to it, it's only because they want to do that. Because people, once you, it's known that you've been in the military, people are going to ask you all kinds of questions who haven't gone. And they will only talk to other veterans. They won't, very seldom. You have exceptions, of course, but for the most part, they won't do it. And what was the other part of your question?
I mean, do you think that like sort of like that putting up like a sort of fake victory front contributed to the isolation that they felt when they got home, knowing that they had to sort of lie about what they were going through?
Yeah. That works both ways too. Sometimes yes, sometimes no. One of the things that makes a difference is that if you have a family member at home, a male family member who has been, for example, a lot of the guys that fought in Korea had parents who had fought, or somebody in their family who had fought in World War II. And they would give them true things that they needed to look out for, that sometimes would be rather sharply different from what they would learn in the military in terms of teaching. Because the number of orientation classes we had to take during basic training was enormous. We saw at least one film a week produced by the War Department for the standpoint of encouraging us and from the standpoint of really, I don't want to use the term indoctrinate, but to kind of encourage us to think about who we were as Americans and how important it was for us to be engaged in whatever we're engaged with. All of the movies that we saw were from World War II. Training films, but they were pretty much still the same of what you did. And you see it. The thing that's so hard was you really feel your personality changing. When I went, if I might be very personal with you, when I went into the Army, I didn't curse, I didn't drink, didn't smoke, and my relationship with girls was, very nice, very respectful, because that's the way I was raised. I had that kind of moral training, particularly from my grandparents, that really injected that kind of thing in me. Shoot. After 6 months, everything I said was expletive. I drank, I smoked, and as soon as we got our first time we ever got a weekend pass, I went with a bunch of guys who just told me, everybody has a nickname. You go in the Army, you get a nickname, and there's nothing you can do about it. We had a guy named Soft Shoes, because he'd go to the shower, he'd come out, go back to, you couldn't hear him walking. He scared people to walk up on him, so we started calling him Soft Shoes. We had a guy named Cabbage Head. He had a real small head, shaped like a cabbage. We had another guy we called Fuji, because he had a head like, didn't have like a forehead where his hair stopped, everything just came straight down. And it looked like a cliff from Mount Fujiyama in Japan, so we called him Fuji. I mean, everybody had a nickname, so they gave me one. Because of my age, I was young blood. And they would say, young blood, you're going out with us today, and we're going to show you, or tonight, we're going to show you this, show you that, and they sure did. And when I went home, people didn't even know who I was. My personality had changed. I mean, changed. And that's almost an immediate change. There used to be a saying, you go in the Army or the Marines, they'll do two things. They'll either make you or break you. That's right. And that's true. I've seen guys cry. I've seen guys, oh, I want to go home. And other guys just take it. You know, but it will make you or you'll break it. But I saw my personality change so radically. I was a non-violent. I never got into any fights when I was a teenager. I was before Dr. King emerged, I was a non-violent person. I was so aggressive in combat training that I was a recruit, and they put me over bayonet training. And you had to take your bayonet, kill. You go stick it, and you say, horizontal butt stroke, whack. What's horizontal butt stroke? What's the other one? Come on, help me. Horizontal.
Vertical.
Vertical.
Yes, it vertical butt stroke. Horizontal butt stroke, vertical butt stroke. And we had to do them and then pull it out. That's how you kill a man. Or you know how to stick your bayonet in the jugular. That's instant death. And we learned all that. I was leading, I was a recruit, but I was so aggressive. And the guy was like, that's how you feel. Can't wait to get into combat. But that's where they train you. You're different. And a lot of families don't recognize the fact that when their loved one comes home different. I was at a going away party 4 years ago for a young man who was 19 going into the Marines, and he was one of these mother's boys. So I told him right out, when he comes home, he's going to be different. Don't mother him. He's going to be 22 years old when he gets home. Leave him alone. Leave him alone. He's different. He's going to be different. He's going to be changed. He's not going to be a nice little boy like you remember him to be. Even your relationship with him, mother and son, that's got to change. Father and son, it's going to change. Everything is going to change until that person becomes readjusted. You don't just get out of the military and go home and pick up where you left off and everything's just great. For those who go through this, there's much that they have to do to kind of regain their normalized footing, to be once more a part of the civilian social crowd. I was a soldier for a year after I got out because all of my thoughts, all of my language, still that. I was a soldier, I was a soldier, I was a soldier. A lot of people know what I was talking about. But that's how it is, you know, you gravitate toward other guys who meant the same thing. Then you have somebody you can talk with about a lot of things. There's some people you just can't talk to because they have no understanding. At least one feels that some of them do. A lot of people have compassion. That's a human element that is priceless. That is compassion. A lot of people have that, but to a returning veteran, early on, nobody has it because they just don't understand. And that's the feeling. You just don't understand. But when this thing takes root, becomes a mental anguish, when it becomes so psychologically a part of a person's personality, that's when difficulties come. And they have to be addressed. When I was in the military, when we got discharged, we could bring weapons home. We had to break them down, put them in our duffel bag, but nobody questioned it. You can bring home, of course, they didn't have the Uzis and all this kind of stuff. They had traditional weapons, but you could break them down, bring them home. They'll still kill you. And especially if you capture weapons in a combat confrontation from the enemy, a flag or hat, but especially a weapon, a gun, then you could, you could take it home with you. Nobody questions it. You just have to check it, be sure that it's checked, and it's gone. You don't have to get anybody's permission but your supply sergeant, and you could bring them on home with you. A lot of guys did. My father was in World War II, and he fought in the Philippines in South Pacific. But he captured a samurai sword from a Japanese officer, or he took it from him, and it was at home. And when my dad died, you clean out the stuff, and we found the sword. So what I did, I gave it to my son-in-law, and who promised me that he would keep it away from their children. What he eventually did was give it to the military, which is all right, fine thing to do. I had to give a rifle to the military. I just called FBI. I said, I got a rifle, come get it. They came. They wanted to question me. I said, it's a rifle, you want it. There it is. I'll tell you anything, just give him a rifle. I had some shells, I gave them to him. I didn't want them anymore. But, you know, that's always a possibility. Yes.
So when veterans come back, do they still feel that sense of nationalism, or do they come back kind of like angry at their country for lying to them about the battlefield?
You know what, they come back, many men come home with very negative thoughts about the military, not about what they've accomplished in terms of friendships. Because you know what the average guy will tell you? I fought for this country, not so much for this country as I did for my buddy. And that's the thing. They said they fought for your buddy. When I told you I was aggressive. They learned that my father was, at that time he was a major. He learned my father was a major. They offered me, at the end of my basic training, they offered me an opportunity to go to officers training school. One of the men who recommended me told me this. He said, well, if you go, if you're successful, if you graduate as a second lieutenant, and they'll assign you generally to a combat unit. But he said, remember though, you can't get close to your men. You don't want to know their names. You won't know where they come from. You don't know anything about them. As far as you're concerned, they're X. Don't get close to your men. And I thought about it, and I thought about my relationship with my buddies, and I said, well, I couldn't do that because I think that I would automatically gravitate to my men. And so I declined the opportunity. But it all depends. No one's the same, but I can say my crowd, the majority, they would do anything, carry out any order, no matter what. But they looking out, you know, for their buddy. And that's how they fight.
There's a great book by Philip Caputo, and it's called The Rumor of War, and
Yeah.
it talks about that transformation that takes place in the life of somebody who, in his case, he was an ROTC person, and then he actually joined. Didn't have to wait for that time. But he talks about his transformation, and as you read the book, you just see where he's moving from sort of that civilian kind of mindset and his glamorization of war and the military, and how he sees, okay, and at the end, wow, I was really lied to. So many people were lied to, kind of thing. But the transformation there. He was an English major, and he taught in the beginning of the book. He described Vietnam like you were there. You could see it. It was fun. And then as you get to as the book continues, he talks about the terrain. You know, okay, so there's cover here, there's that here. So I thought it was just a very interesting book.
I've heard of Phil Caputo. I haven't read that book though. All right, thank you. There's another book that I did read, came out in the early 80s, written by two men who survived the Vietnam War. It's called Blood Brothers. That's a rather wrenching story. I won't go into it, but it has some tough scenario there that they talk about that they experienced. But you mentioned that, ROTC. Now, in the Army, there are two groups of officers that you just hope and pray never come to your unit. That's somebody that's been trained in ROTC, in the college, who graduated to give them a second lieutenant commission, or somebody who goes to officers candidate school. That's, up here they're okay, but here a lot lacking. Who you want to be with though is a West Point graduate. They're cold, they're alienative, they only think one way, military. But they do things that if you follow what they do, your chances of surviving are very, very high. They are the best of soldiers. I mean, they're very heroic. I've never known a West Point man that ever disgraced the uniform. They're very tight, very tight. But the best officer next to the West Point graduate, and you get very few of them, but there are some that come in to your group. But the best are the battlefield commissions. Those are sergeants who perform heroic on the battlefield, and they give them a commission. Usually they skip second lieutenant, they go from field sergeant to first lieutenant. And well, you love those guys because they're experienced, they know exactly what they're doing, and they are men-oriented. Guys who come straight into the unit from training, boy, you could think. We had a 19-year-old second lieutenant, Lieutenant Francis, I'll never forget. He didn't know it. He was 19 years old. He had never been anywhere. He came into the Army, and they sent him to leadership school. And he got out, and he would walk around. Oh, this one we're still in California. He'd walk around doing a yo-yo. That's a long boy. He didn't go overseas, but that was just an example.
He also, Philip could also mention that in the book that when he got to Vietnam, he was sent to Vietnam and he was in charge, and I guess the person that was over him was saying, you know, depend on the guys that have been there. Don't try to exactly.
That's
You're
right.
just afraid.
That's right. Our time about where's the guys? Why are y'all packing up? Y'all gonna leave me? I'm just getting into it. Okay. We'll finish this because we're going to bring in somebody to talk to you, and I want you to raise whatever questions you wish to raise, please, with that person. As a Vietnam vet, and for this course, that's the best person to talk to because they've gone through both phases, the rejection and now the attempt to reconcile.